In the winter of 1867, a Chinese worker named Hung Hua was lowered over the side of a cliff in a wicker basket. The basket swayed in the Sierra Nevada wind, 1,000 feet of nothing between him and the rocks below. In his hands, he held a drill and a canister of nitroglycerin, one of the most unstable explosives ever created. His job was simple: drill a hole into the granite face, pack the nitroglycerin inside, light the fuse, and pray that whoever was holding the rope above would pull him up fast enough before the mountain exploded in his face. If the timing was off by 3 seconds, Hung Hua would cease to exist. Not die. Cease to exist. Nitroglycerin does not leave bodies. It leaves vapor. It leaves red mist on granite. It leaves nothing for a family to bury. Nothing for a mother in Guangdong province to grieve over, and nothing but an empty space where a man used to be. The Central Pacific Railroad did not record Hung Hua's death. They did not record his name. They did not record whether he survived that day or vanished into the mountain like hundreds of others. Because the Central Pacific Railroad did not keep death records for Chinese workers. What we know is this: roughly 12,000 Chinese men built the most dangerous stretch of railroad in American history. They blasted 1,659 feet of tunnel through solid granite using their bare hands, black powder, and nitroglycerin. They lived through winters that buried them under 40 feet of snow. They watched entire work crews disappear in avalanches, their bodies frozen in the mountain until spring thawed them out months later. They were paid $31 a month while white workers earned 35 plus free meals. They built the railroad that stitched America together. And when the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869, not a single Chinese worker was invited to the ceremony, not one. The photographs from that day show railroad executives, politicians, and white laborers celebrating. The men who actually built the thing were nowhere to be found. They had already been erased. This is the story of how America was built on the backs of men whose names we will never know. And this is the debt that has never been paid. To understand why 12,000 Chinese workers ended up on the Sierra Nevada in the 1860s, you need to understand what America was trying to do. And you need to understand how badly it was failing. The idea of a transcontinental railroad had been floating around Washington for decades. Connect the East Coast to California with a single rail line, unite the country, open the West, make fortunes. The logic was obvious. The execution was impossible. The problem was the Sierra Nevada mountain range. The Sierras rise like a wall between California and the rest of the continent. Peaks exceeding 14,000 feet. Granite so dense that standard drill bits shattered against it. Canyons so deep that building bridges across them seemed like fantasy. And winters so brutal that entire settlements had been wiped off the map by snow. The Donner Party had tried to cross these mountains in 1846. 87 pioneers, 48 survived. The rest starved, froze, or were eaten by their companions. The Sierra Nevada did not care about human ambition. The mountains simply waited for you to die. But in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act anyway. 2 companies would build the transcontinental line. The Union Pacific would start in Omaha and build west. The Central Pacific would start in Sacramento and build east. They would meet somewhere in the middle, and whoever laid the most track would receive the most government bonds and land grants. It was a race, and the Central Pacific was losing badly. The Union Pacific had it easy. They were building across the Great Plains. Flat ground, soft earth, simple engineering, 1,000 miles of prairie that offered no resistance. The Central Pacific had the Sierras. They had to climb 7,000 feet in elevation over 100 miles. They had to blast tunnels through mountains that laughed at dynamite. They had to build trestles over canyons that seemed to have no bottom, and they had to do it with a workforce that kept quitting. By 1865, the Central Pacific had barely made it past the California foothills. They were running out of money, they were running out of time, and they were running out of workers. White laborers kept abandoning the line. The work was too hard. The pay was not enough. The mountains were too cold, too dangerous, too unforgiving. Men would sign on for a week, see what they were up against, and walk back down to Sacramento without looking back. Charles Crocker was desperate. Crocker was one of the Big Four, the quartet of Sacramento businessmen who controlled the Central Pacific. He was in charge of construction, and construction was failing. His superintendent, James Strobridge, had already lost an eye to a premature explosion. His crews were deserting. His investors were panicking. And the Union Pacific was laying a mile of track for every foot the Central Pacific managed to scratch out of the granite. Then someone suggested hiring Chinese workers. The idea was controversial. The conventional wisdom of the day held that Chinese men were too small, too weak, too foreign to do real American labor. Strobridge himself opposed it. He wanted white workers, Irish workers, workers he understood. But Crocker was out of options. He pointed out something that the bigotry of the era had overlooked. Chinese workers had built the Great Wall. They had carved terraces into mountainsides for thousands of years. They had a civilization of engineering accomplishments that dwarfed anything America had achieved. And right now, thousands of them were already in California, working the gold fields for scraps because nobody else would hire them. Crocker started with 50 Chinese workers as a test. Within weeks, he was begging for more. These men did not complain. They did not drink. They did not fight. They showed up before dawn and worked until dark. They organized themselves into crews with their own cooks, their own tea carriers, their own foremen. They brought discipline to a job site that had been chaos. Within months, the Central Pacific was hiring every Chinese worker they could find in California. When the state ran dry, they started recruiting directly from Canton, paying for passage across the Pacific. By 1867, Chinese workers made up 90% of the Central Pacific workforce, roughly 12,000 men. They were about to build the impossible. Summit Tunnel was the Central Pacific's greatest challenge. Tunnel number 6, as the engineers called it, 1,659 feet of solid granite running straight through the heart of Donner Peak, near the same pass where those pioneers had resorted to cannibalism 20 years earlier. The mountain was not just hard. It was the hardest granite geologists had ever tested. Drill bits that could bore through ordinary rock shattered on contact. Black powder that could level buildings barely scorched the surface. The plan was simple in concept and suicidal in execution. Attack the mountain from both ends simultaneously. Dig headings from the east and west, inching toward each other until they met in the middle. To speed things up, sink a vertical shaft from above, 73 feet straight down through the rock, then dig outward in both directions from the bottom. 4 teams working toward each other, a race against time, geology, and death. The shaft alone took months. Workers stood in that vertical hole, swinging picks at granite, hauling rock up by bucket, breathing dust so thick it turned their lungs to stone. No ventilation, no natural light, just lamplight and silence, and the endless ringing of steel on rock. When the shaft finally broke through, the real work began. Teams at both ends of the tunnel attacked the mountain 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They worked in 8-hour shifts, rotating endlessly, the sound of drilling and blasting, never stopping for more than the few minutes it took to clear the debris. Progress was measured in inches. On a good day, the crews advanced 12 inches, 1 foot, through granite so dense that each drill hole took hours to cut. Black powder would fracture the surface, and then men would move in with picks and shovels to clear the rubble, coughing through the smoke, their hands bleeding through their gloves. The air inside the tunnel was unbreathable. Black powder smoke mixed with granite dust created a fog that burned the eyes and scored the throat raw. Visibility dropped to nothing. Men worked by feel, by sound, by the guidance of the worker next to them. They developed lung diseases that would kill them decades later, if the tunnel did not kill them first. But black powder was not fast enough. At 1 foot per day, Summit Tunnel would take years to complete. The Central Pacific did not have years. The Union Pacific was already across Nebraska, laying track like men possessed. Charles Crocker needed a miracle. What he got was nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is not like other explosives. Black powder needs a fuse, a flame, time to build. Nitroglycerin needs nothing: a sharp impact, a sudden temperature change, a clumsy hand. That is all it takes. The molecule is so unstable that it exists in a perpetual state of almost explosion. Moving it is dangerous, storing it is dangerous, using it is nearly impossible. But nitroglycerin is also 3 times more powerful than black powder. Where black powder cracked granite, nitroglycerin vaporized it. A single charge could accomplish what 20 charges of black powder could not. Crocker decided the risk was worth it. The first nitroglycerin shipments arrived in 1866. The Central Pacific's own chemist, James Howden, began manufacturing it on site because transporting the liquid over mountain roads was simply too dangerous. Even then, accidents happened constantly. A jolt, a spark, a moment of carelessness, and men would disappear in a flash of light that left nothing behind. The company kept no records of how many workers died to nitroglycerin. Estimates from surviving accounts suggest the number exceeded 500. 500 men erased from existence, their bodies reduced to particles too small to recover. Many of them were Chinese workers, the men most willing to handle the substance that white workers refused to touch. Here is what it meant to work with nitroglycerin in Summit Tunnel. You would drill your hole, and packing the granite dust away with your breath because a metal tool might create a spark. You would receive a small canister of the liquid, carrying it like a child, walking slowly, never stumbling, knowing that a dropped canister was a death sentence. You would pour the nitroglycerin into the hole, insert the blasting cap, string out the fuse, and then you would run. If the fuse burned correctly, you had roughly 30 seconds. If the nitroglycerin was unstable, if it had been jostled on the way down, if the temperature in the tunnel had shifted, you might have no seconds at all. You would simply cease to be, mid-stride, reaching for safety that you would never find. The mountain claimed men in other ways. Cave-ins buried workers under tons of rubble. Falling rocks crushed skulls. Smoke inhalation stopped hearts in their chests. But nitroglycerin was different. Nitroglycerin was personal. It took your body and unmade it. It denied your family even the comfort of remains. And still the Chinese workers went into the tunnels, every shift, every day, because the alternative was starvation, because they had families in Canton who depended on the money they sent home, because they had pride in their work that transcended the contempt of the men who employed them. They pushed the tunnel forward, foot by foot, death by death. By the end of 1866, they had carved halfway through the mountain. Then winter arrived. The winter of 1866 to 1867 was the worst in recorded Sierra Nevada history. Snow began falling in October and did not stop until May. By December, drifts exceeded 20 feet. By February, they exceeded 40. Entire work camps vanished under white silence. But the railroad line, where it existed, disappeared completely. Supply trains could not reach the summit. Men were cut off from the world, stranded in a frozen wasteland with dwindling food and no way out. The Central Pacific had 2 choices: shut down operations until spring and lose the race to the Union Pacific, or keep working through conditions that seemed designed to kill. Crocker chose to keep working. The Chinese crews adapted in ways that stunned their supervisors. They dug beneath the snow, tunnels extending for miles, connecting work sites, bunkhouses, and the entrance to Summit Tunnel. They lived like miners, underground, in a subterranean city carved from compacted snow. The tunnel stayed relatively warm, insulated from the howling winds above. Chimneys vented smoke through shafts to the surface. Men moved between structures without ever seeing sunlight. Above them, the blizzards raged. Wind speeds exceeded 100 miles per hour. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero, and the snow kept falling and piling and pressing down with a weight that no structure could withstand. Avalanches came without warning. A slope that had seemed stable would suddenly release, a wall of snow cascading downward at 60 miles per hour, burying everything in its path. Work camps vanished in seconds. Men eating their dinners, men sleeping in their bunks, men walking between buildings. Gone. Swallowed by the white nothing. The Chinese crews dug for survivors when they could. More often, they dug for bodies. But the bodies were frozen solid, locked in ice that would not thaw for months. Workers discovered their friends in spring. a perfectly preserved, faces still bearing the expression of the moment they died. Some were found standing upright, shovels in hand, flash frozen in the act of clearing the very snow that killed them. Nobody knows how many workers died in the avalanches that winter. The Central Pacific did not count. Contemporary estimates suggest dozens per event. Some historians believe the true number of winter deaths exceeded 100, but without records, without names, without even the acknowledgement that these men deserve to be counted, the real figure remains buried in the Sierra Nevada. Inside the tunnel, work continued. The snow above could not stop men who were already underground. But the conditions inside were barely better than the conditions outside, the ventilation shafts clogged with snow. The air grew thick with smoke and dust. Water seeped through the granite and froze, coating the walls with ice, making every step treacherous. Frostbite took fingers and toes from men who never saw the surface. The Chinese workers wrapped their hands in rags and kept swinging their picks. They worked double shifts because there was nothing else to do. They could not leave. They could not stop. They could only push forward, inch by inch, through a mountain that seemed determined to swallow them whole. By spring 1867, the headings had nearly met. The crews from the east could hear the crews from the west through the diminishing wall of granite between them. They shouted to each other, voices echoing through the rock, counting down the feet, and then the inches until the final barrier fell. On August 28, 1867, the final charge was set. The explosion ripped through the last section of granite, and for the first time, light from one end of the tunnel reached the other. The headings were off by less than 2 inches. 18 months of work, 52 million pounds of rock removed, hundreds of lives lost, and the alignment was nearly perfect. Summit Tunnel was complete. The impossible had been achieved, but the railroad was not finished. Beyond Summit Tunnel lay more mountains, more canyons, more granite. The Chinese crews pushed on, blasting their way through peaks that had never felt a human hand, building trestles over chasms that seemed bottomless. They worked through another winter, another season of avalanches and frozen corpses. They laid track across Nevada's high desert, swinging picks in 100-degree heat after surviving 40-below winters. And they got faster. By 1868, the crews were laying 4 miles of track per day. By 1869, they set a record that still stands, 10 miles and 56 feet of track in a single 12-hour day. Over 25,000 rails placed, handled by roughly 8 men per rail, calculated moves executed in perfect coordination. A symphony of labor that no one thought possible. The Union Pacific took notice. They had been winning the race for years, but suddenly the Central Pacific was closing the gap. The two lines approached each other across Utah, laying parallel tracks in some places because neither company wanted to stop. Finally, Congress intervened and set a meeting point. Promontory Summit, May 10th, 1869. The ceremony was a national celebration. Telegraph wires carried news across the country, and crowds gathered at stations from coast to coast, waiting for the signal that the last spike had been driven. Leland Stanford, one of the Big Four, was given the honor of swinging the hammer. He missed the spike on his first swing. The crowd laughed. He connected on his second attempt, and the nation erupted. The photographs from that day show a sea of faces, railroad executives in their finest suits, politicians angling for credit, white workers who had laid the final stretch of track, soldiers, reporters, dignitaries, everyone who mattered. Not a single Chinese worker appears in those photographs. Not one. After everything they had built, after every life they had sacrificed, after every ton of granite they had blasted and every inch of track they had laid, the Chinese workers were not invited to the celebration. They were not thanked, and they were not acknowledged. They were simply expected to disappear, which is exactly what happened. Many returned to California, where they faced violence, discrimination, and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned further immigration from China for decades. The Central Pacific Railroad became one of the most profitable enterprises in American history. The Big Four became some of the wealthiest men in the world. Leland Stanford founded a university. Collis Huntington built a mansion. Charles Crocker commissioned a palace. The Chinese workers got nothing. No pensions, no recognition, no monument. Not even a list of names to remember them by. Here is what we owe these men, and here is what we have failed to pay. We owe them acknowledgement. For over a century, American history textbooks mention the Transcontinental Railroad without mentioning who built it. Children learned about the Golden Spike Ceremony without learning that the men who made it possible were deliberately excluded. The story was told as a triumph of American engineering, American will, American destiny. But the hands that did the work were Chinese. The blood that soaked the granite was Chinese. The lives that were erased from history were Chinese. We owe them names, 12,000 men, and we cannot name 100 of them with certainty. The Central Pacific kept meticulous financial records, tracking every penny spent on supplies, equipment, and executive salaries. They did not bother to record the names of workers who died. A man could vanish in an avalanche, his body not recovered until months later, and no one would write down what he was called or where he came from or who might be waiting for word of his fate. The few names we have come from accident. Payroll records that happened to survive. Letters sent home that were preserved by families. Newspaper accounts that bothered to mention an individual rather than a mass. Hunghua, Afong, Chinhua, fragments of identity, floating in a sea of anonymity. We owe them the truth about their deaths. The official story has always been that approximately 1,000 Chinese workers died building the Transcontinental Railroad. That number is almost certainly wrong. It does not account for the avalanche victims whose bodies were never found. It does not account for the nitroglycerin deaths that left nothing to count. It does not account for the men who died weeks or months later from injuries sustained on the line, or the men who died decades later from lung diseases contracted in the tunnels. A more honest estimate would likely exceed 2,000. Some historians believe it could approach 4,000. We will never know because no one cared enough to count. We owe them their place in the story of America. These men did not come to this country seeking handouts or charity. They came seeking work, and they found the hardest work available. They did not complain. They did not strike, though they had every reason to. They did not demand equality, though they were paid less for more dangerous labor. They simply built. They built the infrastructure that allowed America to become a continental power. They built the transportation network that drove the Gilded Age. They built the foundation of the modern American economy, and America responded by banning their families from joining them. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first law in American history to restrict immigration based on nationality. It was written specifically to prevent more Chinese workers from entering the country after they had served their purpose. The men who built the railroad were told they could stay, but their wives could not come, their children could not come, their parents could not come. They were to remain in America alone, growing old without families, dying without descendants, leaving nothing behind but the tracks they had laid. The last Chinese railroad worker died sometime in the early 20th century. We do not know his name. We do not know his story. We only know that he was the final connection to an era that America has spent over a century trying to forget. But the granite remembers. Summit Tunnel still stands, still carries freight trains through the Sierra Nevada, still bears the marks of drill holes and blast scars from 1867. If you walk inside that tunnel today, you can put your hand on the walls and feel the texture of the rock that those men shaped. The stone is cold. It is silent, but it holds the memory of every hammer swing, every explosion, every life that ended in darkness so that trains could pass through light. There is a plaque at Donner Pass now, finally erected over a century late, acknowledging the Chinese workers who built the railroad. It is a small gesture, a token, an apology that comes too late to matter to anyone who might have received it. The men who deserved recognition are all gone. Their descendants, scattered across the world, may not even know their great-great-grandfathers died in these mountains. But recognition still matters, not for the dead, who are beyond caring, for the living, for those of us who benefit every day from infrastructure built on bones we never bothered to count, for those of us who drive on highways and ride on trains and walk through cities that were made possible by sacrifices we never acknowledged. The story of the Chinese railroad workers is not a comfortable story. It does not end with triumph. It does not offer redemption. It simply asks us to remember what we have collectively chosen to forget. 12,000 men came to the Sierra Nevada. They blasted through granite. They survived winters that should have killed them all. They built the impossible, and America pretended they did not exist. The railroad still runs. The trains still pass through Summit Tunnel, the same tunnel that Honghua and Afong and Chinhua carved out of the mountain with nitroglycerin and hope. The whistle echoes off the granite walls, the same walls that absorbed the screams of men buried in avalanches, the same walls that still bear the scorch marks of explosions that ended lives in fractions of seconds. Listen to that whistle. It carries more than sound. It carries the weight of history, the weight of debt, the weight of 12,000 names we never learned and will never know. This is the story of how America was built, not by the men who took the credit, not by the executives who counted the profits, but by the workers who gave everything and received nothing in return. The debt remains unpaid. The names remain unspoken. The granite remains silent. But now at least you know. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. I tell stories like this one because they matter, because the people who built this country deserve to be remembered even when history tried to erase them. Hit the subscribe button so you do not miss what comes next. And if you want to go deeper into the forgotten history of American labor, into the men and women who built everything we take for granted today, click the video on screen now.